freedom of speech? Stick around to find out. All right, so let's talk about the Catholic Church and what it teaches about freedom of speech. We're going to examine what the magisterium, the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, has to say about this. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look at a few documents of the Catholic Church that goes over this particular question. And one that we really need to focus on here is Gaudium et Spes, which is from the Second Vatican Council. This is an ecumenical council from 1962 to 65, roughly. It's the 21st Ecumenical Council, and it's the most recent one. This is a large body of bishops, about 2,500 of them, who came together and spoke about a number of issues. But in Gaudium et Spes, they touch on, among many things, the question of freedom of speech. So we're going to take a look here at Gaudium et Spes. Let me pull up the particular reference here. One second, because I had it highlighted, but it moved on me, so I want to make sure I'm in the right place. Okay, it's Gaudium et Spes 59. And here it is. It's kind of towards the end of paragraph 59. So let's read it together. All this supposes that, within the limits of morality and the common utility, man can freely search for the truth. Let me scroll over there. Express his opinion and can publish it, that he can practice. Let me find the spot here. He can practice any art he chooses, that finally he can avail himself of true information concerning events of a public nature. Now, here's the key part. As for public authority, it is not its function to determine the character of civilization, but rather to establish the conditions and to use the means which are capable of fostering the life of culture among all, even within the minorities of a nation. And then it says this: it is necessary to do everything possible to prevent culture from being turned away from its proper end and made to serve as an instrument of political or economic power. So here you do see that the church recognizes that there is a certain freedom of speech. And again, this is the Second Vatican Council. So a lot of the documents that we're going to take a look at after this are going to kind of build on this. So if you see a reference to Gaudium et Spes in the future, this is the part that it's referring to. Man can freely search for the truth, express his opinion, and can publish it. But it is going to have some qualifications. So look at this next one. This is from Communio et Progressio under Pope Paul VI, who is one of the popes of the Second Vatican Council. He's the one who closed the Second Vatican Council. Well, it says in paragraph 26, if public opinion is to emerge in the proper manner, it is absolutely essential that there be freedom to express ideas and attitudes. So again, there is a certain freedom of speech that is granted according to the Catholic Church. It recognizes that. In accordance with the express teaching of the Second Vatican Council, it is necessary unequivocally to declare that freedom of speech for individuals and groups must be permitted. Now, notice this qualification, because this is key right here. It must be permitted so long as the common good and public morality be not endangered. And let me maybe zoom in on that a little bit more. See if you can see that a little bit better. Well, it cuts off the text, so that's as good as I'm going to be able to get it for you. But right here, it gives a qualification. Yes, there's freedom of speech up until a certain point. What is that point? Well, it says, so long as the common good and public morality be not endangered. So, if someone's speech is jeopardizing the common good, the good of society as a whole, and public morality, then there is no freedom for that speech. So, in other words, the Catholic Church does not teach an absolute freedom of speech, but a limited freedom of speech. If it will encroach on the common good and public morality, then there is a limit. Now, you then have to ask questions. Okay, well, who determines the common good and public morality? Well, certainly the Catholic Church can. As the teaching authority that Jesus established on earth, the Catholic Church can. But what happens if you have a state that doesn't believe in the Catholic Church, that doesn't profess the Catholic religion? How do you then determine the common good and public morality? Well, you still have the natural law. Even if you don't appeal to revelation from God, you still have the natural law that is known to every human. This is our ability to reason and determine what is moral by knowledge that is known through reason, not necessarily that is known through revelation, although revelation often confirms the very same thing that we can know by reason. So you don't even have to appeal to somehow a Catholic state to determine common good and public morality. A secular state, a state that does not profess the Catholic religion, can still determine what is the common good and public morality insofar as it is known by the natural law. And that is a Catholic position. The Catholic Church recognizes that we have that ability to determine what is right and what is wrong through even natural faculties, natural means. It goes on to say, in order that men may usefully cooperate and further improve the life of the community, there must be freedom to assess and compare differing views, which seem to have weight and validity. Okay, so there is some permissibility to explore positions, to have discussions. Within this free interplay of opinion, there exists a process of give and take, of acceptance or rejection, of compromise or compilation. And within the same process, the more valid ideas can gain ground so that a consensus that will lead to common action becomes possible. All right, now from the same document, but a little bit later in the document, it says this in paragraph 84 concerning citizens and the civil authorities. The media are there for the good of everyone and to serve everyone. So, at once, they concern both citizens and public authorities. These authorities have the essential duty of maintaining freedom of speech and of seeing that the right conditions exist for it. Every individual must have the chance of following his informed judgment. Human dignity must be fully respected. So, one of the reasons why we have freedom of speech is because it is rooted in human dignity. The good of the country and the interests of international cooperation must both be given due consideration. So you kind of see a little bit of a qualification there. Yes, there's this freedom of speech, but the good of the country and interests of international cooperation must also be given due consideration. Now, if you go to the Compendium of the Catholic Church, paragraph 421, here's what it says. The Second Vatican Council committed the Catholic Church to the promotion of religious freedom. The Declaration Dignitatis Humanae explains in its subtitle that it intends to proclaim the right of the person and of communities to social and civil freedom in religious matters. In order that this freedom, willed by God and inscribed in human nature, may be exercised, no obstacle should be placed in its way, since the truth cannot be imposed except by virtue of its own truth. The dignity of the person and the very nature of the quest of God require that all men and women should be free from every constraint in the area of religion. So, one of the reasons why there is freedom of speech and freedom from constraint is to pursue the one true God and the one true faith. And Dignitatis Humanae makes that explicit at the very beginning of the document. It's not a freedom for error, it's rather a freedom to embrace the one true religion in the Catholic Church, according to Dignitatis Humanae. Society and the state must not force a person to act against his conscience or prevent him from acting in conformity with it. But obviously, there's going to be some qualifications to that, as we saw. If it starts to violate the common good and public morality, now we got a qualification. Religious freedom is not a moral license to adhere to error, nor as an implicit right to err. So it's not a right to err or to adhere to error. It's not a moral license to err. Not at all. Freedom is freedom to choose the good, not to choose bad. That is no freedom. That's slavery if you choose bad, if you choose sin, if you choose evil. Okay, but we're going to see a little bit more concerning qualifications. Saw some qualifications already, but now listen to this. This is from Mirari Vos. This is Gregory the 16th from 1832. So he has some very strong things to say about freedom of speech that helps balance out what we just saw. Because what we just saw, there's some qualifications there, but they're not being highlighted very much. But we can balance them out with things that the magisterium has said elsewhere, and we can put them together and we can harmonize them. They're not contradictory, but you're going to get a little bit of a different emphasis here. And I kind of feel like the emphasis that we're getting here from Gregory the 16th turned out to be very prophetic and very applicable to our day and our time. I almost feel like he's writing about us today. And yet this is 1832. Listen to this. Here we must conclude that harmful and never sufficiently denounced freedom to publish any writings whatsoever and disseminate them to the people, which some dare to demand and promote with so great a clamor. So what he's saying is the freedom to publish just anything and everything, this is harmful, and he's denouncing it. Now, that is reconcilable with what we just read, because what we just read is, yes, there's freedom of speech, but only up until the point that it starts to violate the common good and public morality. At that point, you don't have it. And what he's emphasizing is, well, those who are trying to corrupt faith and morals, those who are trying to corrupt society and saying, hey, we have the freedom to do this. We can publish anything we want. We got this freedom of speech. And he wants to say, no, that you don't have freedom to do that. And the church has always been consistent on that point. There is this freedom of speech, but up until a certain point. And he's emphasizing the limits here. By the way, if you're enjoying this show, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I've been mentioning the last few days, I look at the analytics and the majority of viewers who are watching are not subscribed. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It would help me out tremendously. So if you've been benefiting from this channel and enjoying the content and enjoying this show, go ahead and do that for me. And hit the like button while you're at it as well. Okay, So it says, we are horrified to see what monstrous doctrines and prodigious errors are disseminated far and wide in countless books, pamphlets, and other writings, which, though small in weight, are very great in evil and malice. Wow. Is he writing today? Is he reading Facebook? Is he watching CNN? Uh, wow, this is incredible. It describes our time. And I see it constantly. I see people say, oh, but we can say whatever we want, freedom of speech. No, 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 no. I've seen Catholics say this. That's not what the church teaches. It teaches freedom of speech, but only up until a certain point. You don't get to corrupt society. You don't get to go that far. You don't get to harm public morality. You don't get to do that. Um, it continues. We are in tears at the abuse which proceeds from them over the face of the earth. Some are so carried away that they contentiously assert that the flock of heirs arising from them is sufficiently compensated by the publication of some book which defends religion and truth. Every law condemns deliberately doing evil simply because there is some hope that good may result. Ends don't justify the means. Is there any sane man who would say poison ought to be distributed, sold publicly, stored, and even drunk because some antidote is available and those who use it may be snatched from death again and again? You know what he's condemning? Those people today who are saying, oh, well, you don't have to limit speech. We need more speech, and all we need to do is just correct the error. He's saying that's foolishness. He's saying no, because would any sane man say, well, hey, just because there's an antidote for poison, let's go ahead and spread that poison everywhere? There's an antidote out there, so it's okay, right? Let's go ahead and allow for error to be spread everywhere, for the corruption of society, because there's an antidote, we can speak against it. Yeah, how's that working out for society? Is that working out really well? Pretty sure that hasn't been working out very well for us in the West. And we're seeing the fruits of this approach, and they are pretty rotten. And this Pope is rightly condemning that in a very prophetic way. It was obviously applicable in his own day and is certainly applicable for us today. But again, I have to emphasize that's not to say there isn't freedom of speech, but up until a certain point, you go past a certain line, you no longer have a freedom of speech according to the church, even if the refutation of the error being disseminated is made available. Even if. Why? Because not everybody will access the refutation. Not everybody may understand the refutation, and so on. Now, watch what he says here. This is where Catholics really need to pay attention. The church has always taken action to destroy the plague of bad books. Let me stop and show you this thing right here. You see that? You see this pretty well right there? Okay. Show that to you. That is a 1901 copy in Latin of the Index of Forbidden Books. Ever heard of it? It's a list of banned books in the Catholic Church, which might not be canonically applicable, but the church still says it's morally applicable. The church still morally says you need to guard yourself in what you feed yourself, what you read. You need to be discerning. But the Catholic Church, even at one point canonically, had penalties for those who read anything in the Index of Forbidden Books without permission. Why? Because, like any good father, you would want your children to be guarded in what they read. You don't allow your children access to just anything and everything. You would want them to read good stuff, and you would want to keep away bad stuff from them. Same thing spiritually. So the church has always taken action to destroy bad books, it says. And that kind of goes with this notion of the index of forbidden books. This was true even in apostolic times, for we read that the apostles themselves burned a large number of books. It may be enough to consult the laws of the Fifth Council of the Lateran on this matter and the constitution which Leo X published afterwards, lest that which has been discovered advantageous for the increase of the faith and the spread of useful arts be converted to the contrary use and work harm for the salvation of the faithful. This also was a great concern to the Fathers of Trent, the Council of Trent, who applied a remedy against the great evil by publishing that wholesome decree concerning the index of books, which contains false doctrine. That right there. It goes on to say, we must fight valiantly, Clement XIII says in an encyclical letter about the banning of bad books, as much as the matter itself demands, and must exterminate the deadly poison of so many books. For never will the material for error be withdrawn unless the criminal sources of depravity perish in flames. I think we're seeing the folly of having abandoned this wisdom. We're seeing that today. We're seeing people resurrect and revive errors that had been put to death in previous generations, and they're just being brought right back. And we're seeing how much damage it's doing to society. Thus, it is evident that this Holy See has always striven throughout the ages to condemn and to remove suspect and harmful books. The teaching of those who reject the censure of books as too heavy a burden causes immense harm to the Catholic people and to this see. They are even so depraved as to affirm that it is contrary to the principle of law, and they deny the church the right to decree and to maintain it. I've even heard wayward Catholics say this kind of stuff. Condemned by the magisterium. They're being condemned by the magisterium. Some think that the church doesn't have the authority to do this. Again, condemned by the magisterium, by the very church that they claim to be part of. Now, let's take a look at Immortale Dei. So this is going to be also sort of an older document. This is Leo the 13th. So he is going to be the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. Let me get the date on that for sure. 1885 on this one. Okay. So he says in paragraph 32, so too, the liberty of thinking and of publishing whatsoever each one likes, without any hindrance, is not in itself an advantage over which society can wisely rejoice. Shot at us today. Because you hear people, they relish in this, they boast in it, in this absolute freedom of speech. And they think that's a virtue. Rather, it's foolishness, according to what the church is saying. On the contrary, it is the fountainhead and origin of many evils. Yep, we're seeing that today. Liberty is a power perfecting man, and hence should have truth and goodness for its object. But the character of goodness and truth cannot be changed at option. These remain ever one and the same and are no less unchangeable than nature itself. If the mind assents to false opinions, and the will chooses and follows after what is wrong, neither can attain its native fullness, but both must fall from their native dignity into an abyss of corruption. Whatever, therefore, is opposed to virtue and truth may not rightly be brought temptingly before the eyes of man, much less sanctioned by the favor and protection of the law. So, in other words, this cannot be protected by the state. At that point, whenever it is harming the public good and public morality, the state is to step in and stop it and prevent it. A well spent life is the only way to heaven, whither all are bound. And on this account, the state is acting against the laws and dictates of nature whenever it permits the license of opinion and of action to lead minds astray from truth and souls away from the practice of virtue. So, in other words, you know that phrase, an unjust law is no law at all? That's kind of what's going on here. If a law is sanctioning something that goes against nature, something that you can know through reason is morally corrupt and is harmful to society, it's no law at all. It's no law at all. To exclude the church founded by God himself from life, from laws, and from the education of youth, from domestic society is a grave and fatal error. And yet that is one of the errors that so many of us in this country have embraced. Are we waking up to the consequences of that error yet? A state from which religion is banished can never be well regulated, and already perhaps more than is desirable, is known of the nature and tendency of the so-called civil philosophy of life and morals. So he's going against a secular state, a religiously neutral state. Did you know that the Catholic Church at the Second Vatican Council teaches, and still teaches to this very day, that the state has an obligation to pursue and embrace the Catholic faith? The state has an obligation to be Catholic. The Church of Christ is the true and sole teacher of virtue and guardian of morals. She it is who preserves in their purity the principles from which duties flow, and by setting forth most urgent regions for virtuous life bids us not only to turn away from wicked deeds, but even to curb all movements of the mind that are opposed to reason, even though they be not carried out in action. So we're now even talking about opposing some things that haven't necessarily been carried out into action yet. I imagine a lot of Catholics would be shocked to find out this is what the church teaches, still teaches to this very day. But then you have to ask, okay, so are they being formed more by their secular state or by the Catholic faith? Where are they getting their formation from when it comes to freedom of speech? Catechism of the Catholic Church says, the right to the exercise of freedom, especially in religious and moral matters, is an inalienable requirement of the dignity of man. It's rooted in man's dignity. But, notice the qualification, but the exercise of freedom does not entail the putative right to say or do anything. You have freedom of speech, but up unto a point. You can't say and do whatever you want if it is harming the common good and public morality. You don't have that freedom. So it's a limited freedom of speech, not an absolute freedom of speech. By the way, even the American system, even the American government doesn't recognize an absolute freedom of speech. You can't scream, fire at a movie theater and not expect to get arrested if you're lying. You can't scream bomb on an airplane. There's some things that you can't do. There's some things you can't say. You will have consequences for them, even in the American system. Well, the Catholic Church is even a little bit further than that, because the American government will allow for some things that are corrupting society, Whereas the Catholic Church says, no, actually, the state should be stepping in and not allowing for some of those things if it goes against public morality and the common good. The Bible, for instance, the revelation that we've received from God has never, ever affirmed an absolute freedom of speech. It's always been limited in nature. I want you to take a look at Leviticus 24:16 and notice this limit on speech, even in the Old Testament. And it endures, again, as we saw in the New Covenant, because everything we've been reading is about the New Covenant. But even in the Old Testament, there was a limit on speech. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. There was capital punishment for it. All the congregation shall stone him. The sojourners as well as the natives, so foreigners as well as natives, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. That is a limit on the freedom of speech in the Old Testament. That same limit continues in the New Testament, whether it be about blasphemy or other things that corrupt society. Now, in the New Covenant, we may not necessarily have the death penalty for blasphemy or something like that. But that doesn't mean that the state shouldn't do something about it. According to the Catholic perspective, it should do something about it. So one thing that I'm really sick and tired of is listening to Catholics who continue to promote this view of an absolute freedom of speech. And they think that it somehow is consistent with what the American government has considered to be freedom of speech. And more importantly, consistent with what the Catholic Church says about freedom of speech. And they pretend like they have this right to an absolute freedom of speech. And I'm just sitting here thinking, you've never heard of the Index of Forbidden Books before? You've never read anything from the Catholic Church on freedom of speech? Seriously? I suppose I would expect somebody promoting an absolute freedom of speech who is just purely a secularist. I suppose I could expect that from them, but not from Catholics. Catholics need to know better. So I hope this video, it helps to that end. If you see some kind of Catholic content creator or Catholic influencer or whatever promote a view about an absolute freedom of speech, kindly remind them the Catholic Church has never taught that, and it condemns that view as madness. And maybe point them to a few of these sources in the pre-conciliar church as well as the post-conciliar church. Well, I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. And of course, check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support what I'm doing here. All right. See y'all tomorrow. Have a good night. Hey, I really hope that you're enjoying the content so far. If you are, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It will help me out tremendously. Also, go ahead and press the like button. And if you want to support this channel, visit patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to plenty of extra exclusive content for patrons only. God bless.